We have a nation of single moms, single men who are lonely and without purpose, children who are dad deprived. I think all of us want to understand what is happening with boys. Why are they falling so far behind girls in every single academic area? Women have women's centers and men also have men's centers. They're called prisons, centers for dad-deprived boys. There doesn't need to be as much pressure on men to have to do jobs that they don't want to do in order to make more money. More U.S. military are killed by suicide in 1 year than were killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in all years combined. And yet you very rarely hear about that. There are so many challenges that are unexplored that boys are experiencing. Dad-deprived boys are far more likely to bully, far more likely to be bullied. 7 out of the 8 boys that did school shootings, dad-deprived boys. What does the future hold for boys and men? I could not be hired at any major university in the United States for saying the things you've heard in the last 2 days. That's how dangerous talking this way is. Let me spend a little bit of time giving you a bit of background so you understand where I'm coming from. This is me, actually, with a fellow woman named Gloria Steinem, who you may recognize. And my first days in gender issues were with the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. As I got involved with them, they were having a big debate as to whether or not there should be men involved in the National Organization for Women or not. And the main issue was that every month they had what they called consciousness-raising groups to make women more aware of the degree to which men had a system of patriarchy that was keeping them oppressed and the degree to which they felt they were able to get in touch with the things that were bothering them. And so the problem was that when men attended these once per month meetings, the women felt very inhibited from really opening up and saying what they really felt. And that was, from my perspective, totally understandable. And so they were debating whether to kick men out completely from now. And their compromise, I'm always a compromise, the compromise was me. And they said, listen, let Warren Farrell form some men's groups and get the men out of the women's hair, and let's see if that works. And so I did do that. And it worked from their perspective. And I went through 2 phases in that era. Phase 1 was getting the men together. And then after they spoke for a minute or 2, I give them a feminist lecture as to why they were wrong and why a feminist perspective was more accurate and how their consciousness was not raised. And one day I decided to actually listen as opposed to telling them a different ideology. And as I started listening, they didn't trust me at first, but eventually they opened up and began telling stories that I sort of resonated with in my own life and my father's information to me about why I shouldn't be a writer, for example, because a writers rarely find publishers. And if you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife. Therefore, just do something that makes money. You're good at math, so do math. But then I began to be in touch with my own feelings and sort of more open to what they were really saying and what they were really feeling. And here I was telling them to feel, but I was lecturing to them, which did not draw out their feelings. And so once I started to do that listening, I began to sort of integrate some of those to my lectures. I was now lecturing all around the world on women's issues and the importance of women's issues, both to women and also to men. But now I started integrating some of the boys' and men's perspectives, or the perspectives of the men and the fathers, and sharing what their sons' perspectives were. And as I did that, instead of expanding my audience, it shrank my audience. My standing ovations went from standing ovations to sitting ovations. My referrals to other speaking engagements, which was my source of income, went from about 4 per speech to down to 1, then down to 0 to 1. And so I began to see the handwriting on the wall. But I also thought it was important to sort of share both sexes' perspective as opposed to just one's. And then sort of the straw that broke the camel's back was I was at a board meeting of the National Organization for Women in New York City, and I started to see the beginning of the evidence. This was the early 70s, and there was already a lot of divorces occurring that to a much greater degree than in the 60s and the 50s. And so I started to see that the first children of divorce were not doing very well, but particularly those children that did not have fathers involved after the divorce. And so I mentioned some of this information to the board members, and total silence. And finally, one of the women, one of the braver ones, spoke up and said, Warren, the National Organization for Women has a lot of issues to deal with. Our feminist members, they want to be able to say, after divorce, let us decide what's right for the children. If we want the father involved, we should have the father involved. If we don't want the father involved, we shouldn't have to have the father involved. If we force them into sort of this equal shared parenting stuff that you're talking about, this is going to alienate some members, and that will lose them not only for the custody issues, but also for other issues that we want to support. Well, I understood that, but I didn't feel very good about that. And then they also pointed out to me that, Warren, your source of income comes from almost all feminist referrals. Just let that sink in. And I had already told them that this was just the beginning of the research. And so the compromise, quote unquote, was for me to go out and do more research before I spoke up. And in fact, I did. But the more research I did, the more I began to see that this was not just the beginning of data. I was identifying to them about 5 or 6 ways that boys in particular, but also girls, suffered when they didn't have dad involvement. I was now beginning to accumulate some of the data that eventually led me to identifying more than 50 different ways, from suicide to depression to many of the things that I'll talk about. And actually, before I do talk about some of those things in terms of what's statistically true, let me just ask you for a moment. Would you close your eyes for a moment with me? And just think about people in your neighborhood or your school or in your family that have had problems with both boys and girls. And think about whether there's been more boys affected negatively by a tendency to sort of emotionally withdraw, become addicted to video games, get poorer grades in school, be belligerent, have problems with their own motivation. Raise your hand if some of the boys that you know or know of are more likely to have these problems than girls. Just open your eyes and raise your hand. So I'm seeing every hand raised, so 100% of us have seen that. And this, I'm not just talking about an isolated incident here and there, but about a pattern that is dominant in the culture. And unfortunately, many of us have seen this, but not necessarily seen the complete evidence that surrounds this. What I'll be sharing with you today is, and tomorrow and the next day, is 3 things. 1 is the overall evidence for the boy crisis. 2, 5 of the most important causes, and then about a dozen solutions. And those solutions will be at both the personal level, like family dinner nights, and also at the political level, like at the national level, the school level, and the local level. The boy crisis exists both in the United States and globally in the 70 largest developed nations. So I'm going to start with the evidence of the U.S. crisis and then move to the global crisis. Here's a bit of the evidence of the U.S. crisis. You can begin to see that when boys and girls are both 9 years old or under, they both commit suicide very rarely, and they commit suicide at about an equal level. But at the ages of 10 to 14, boys commit suicide at twice the rate of girls. Between the ages of 15 and 19, at 4 times the rate of girls. And between the ages of 20 and 24, between about 5.5 times the rate of girls. So you can see that something during the years in which boys learn to be boys does not inspire all boys, to say the least. I'm going to look at the mental health besides suicide for boys. More U.S. military are killed by suicide in 1 year than were killed in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan in all years combined. And yet you very rarely hear about that. In the mental health area in the United States, there's a huge gap between what happens with teenage boys and teenage girls. Between 5 and 7 hours of video games per week are actually pretty healthy by most studies. Teenage boys use video games, though, about 13 plus hours a week, and that's gone up even more recently. Teenage girls use them about 5 hours a week. So there's a big difference between the video game usage between our boys, sons and our daughters. And here's the implications of that. Playing video games motivates our brain to win at the game, but it doesn't motivate us to win at life. I'll explain the difference there. Video games have a lot of the stimulus when they're in excess that cocaine has. Playing video games motivates our brain to win at the game, but it doesn't motivate our brain to win at life. And here's the distinction between those two in the brain. Real life achievements get registered in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of the brain, and video game success creates dopamine, and that's a feel-good drug in the nucleus accumbens part of the brain, and that rewards you for winning at the game, but it doesn't reward you for winning at life. Two different motivators in the brain. It's one of the reasons why people who are younger and they really get on a high from winning game after game, and they think that that's really increasing their brain's power overall. It is increasing their brain's power in the area that stimulates them to win more games, distinct from what helps them win at life in general. And so that's a huge, huge difference. And it's one of the reasons we see so many kids moving to an addiction level at video games, but not kids in general, to a much greater degree, boys. By age 21, boys average 14,000 hours of gaming. You can achieve a bachelor's degree in about a third of that time. To me, that's amazing. Let's move over from mental health to physical health in the United States. In just 90 years, the male-female life expectancy gap in the U.S. Has increased more than 400%. In 1920, there was only 1 year difference between male life expectancy and female life expectancy. In 2021, the year from the most recent data, 5.3-year life expectancy gap between males and females. Male life expectancy is decreasing. Before COVID, which is the only fair time to measure life expectancy for obvious reasons, the 3 years before COVID, male life expectancy went down 3 years in a row. That's an historical first for non-COVID, non-war era. But female life expectancy did not. Obviously, no one wants female life expectancy to decrease, but we also don't want male life expectancy to decrease, especially 3 years in a row. That's when it really shows a pattern that is problematic. Boys today have sperm counts less than half of what their grandfathers had at their age. And of course, that affects the fertility and the health and vitality of female children. This is really a good example of the impact of either sex having problems. If you have the sperm counts of males going down, that affects female children as well as male children. And it's really a perfect metaphor for what happens when we're all in the same family boat. When it appears that only one sex loses, obviously both sexes lose. For the first time in U.S. history, our sons will have less education than their dads. Take a look here at bachelor's degrees. Notice that on the upper left-hand side, you see a male figure. The bachelor degrees in 1969, boys got 57% of the bachelor's degrees. Girls or women got 43%. In 2020, the trend has reversed. Boys get 42% of bachelor degrees, women 58%. It's projected that in a few years, the ratio of female to male bachelor's degrees will become 2 to 1. One of the reasons for that is that boys get admitted to college at a certain rate, but drop out 10% more frequently than girls do. So you add the fewer admissions together with the greater failure in school during college, despite affirmative action programs now beginning to go in the direction of males, getting them into college. The males are still dropping out at a faster rate. There are today more than 2.8 million more women than men with post-secondary school degrees. 2.8 million difference. So let's look at the implications of that for families. Female graduates are rarely on the lookout for future fathers who are dropouts. Female graduates do not tend to be highly attracted to male dropouts. And yet there are 2.8 million more women either competing for this much smaller group of men or saying, I can't take it. I'm going to be a single mom. So we see the single mom data, and this is one of the reasons for that single mom data. So let's look at the whole picture here. As for male high school dropouts, more than 20% of male high school dropouts, which are much more common among young men than women, more than 20% of them are unemployed in their 20s. So imagine a woman who's a college graduate wanting to have a future husband who's about her equal, looking around for a future husband. She has those considerations, and she also has another consideration. Boys today are 66% of the people likely to live back with their parents, usually in their parents' basements. So imagine this female walking around with a sign saying, looking for a future husband, please. And she searches unemployment lines. Well, maybe not. Then she searches parents' basements and she puts, any dropouts in here? It's not a likely scenario for a female to feel inspired. And again, it's an example of the lose-lose situation. Boys and men appear to be the losers, and yes, they are, but they're also girls and women who are looking for responsible, talented, intelligent, equally educated males to be the fathers of their children, and they can't find them either. And so it's another example when either sex loses, both sexes lose. So in brief, you have fewer bachelor's degrees and more bachelors. And here's the trend. We have a nation of single moms, and we have a nation of single men who are lonely and without purpose. We have a nation of children who are dad deprived. So that's 3 groups, but there's actually 4 lose-lose-lose situations. Men, women, children, and our nation. Let's look at IQs for a moment. Boys who are nearly 12 years old today are doing only as well as the 8 to 9-year-old boys in the 70s on their IQ tests. We'll see that this is not just in the United States, but I'll get to this data globally as well. So let me switch over to the evidence for a global crisis. All around the world, they have terms that imply a boy crisis. In China, it's women up, men down. In Japan, it's herbivores or socially isolated. In a good part of Europe, it's an acronym called NEAT, which is not in education, employment, or training. And in Sweden recently, they identified it as the boy crisis. I don't know whether my book had any impact or not, but I'll make believe it did. In India, the male suicide rate in India is growing more than 9 times that of the female suicide rate, 37% male versus 4% female since the year 2000. In the UK, in 2015, more men died by suicide than all British soldiers fighting in all wars since 1945. Part of the amazing part of this data is the data. Another part is that almost nobody has heard of this before. If these things were happening to girls and women, it would be all over the news and we'd all be really aware of it. And we all should be really aware of it because nobody would want this to be happening to girls and women. The research published in the medical journal Lancet, which you've probably all heard of, says suicide now takes more lives than war, murder, and natural disasters combined, stealing more than 36 million healthy years of healthy life around the world. The evidence on the global level, that's physical. If male and female mortality rates were equal, it would save more lives than curing cancer. The results of a 20-country study concluded this data about female and male mortality rates saving more lives than curing cancer if they were both equal. Boys today have sperm counts less than half of what their grandfathers had at their age. Notice that this is global, as well as what we all already saw being U.S. sperm counts. The UN finds that boys have fallen behind girls in every one of 70 of the largest developed nations, especially in reading and writing. And as you probably all know, reading and writing are the single biggest predictors of academic success or failure. They're not the biggest predictors of life success or failure. The biggest predictors of life success or failure is postponed gratification. But the biggest predictor of academic success or failure is the ability to read and write, and that's also a big predictor of life success or failure. Note that the U.S. is last among 31 nations when comparing the decline in degree attainment of males between the ages of 25 and 34 versus the generation before, ages 55 to 64. Here's the big discovery about IQs. Usually IQs go up about 10 points per generation. In the almost 2 generations since 1980, that would predict IQs on average going up about 20 points. But instead, boys' IQs have dropped 15 points since the 1980s. So if you add those 20 points to the 15 points, you have almost 35-point loss of potential IQ as a result of the dynamics that we'll be discussing that have led to the boy crisis. What a loss for not just boys, but for everybody that interacts with boys. So I'd like to get now into some of the causes for this. I want to say first that there's a lot of causes to the boy crisis. And I was tempted to go with a lot of the causes that we all sort of see identified around us. Causes such as the lack of male teachers, there's a cutting back on recess, there's a cutting back on vocational education. These causes have been out there in the media, but they're not the real causes. They are the symptoms. What I want to deal with this group is the underlying causes that are creating these symptoms so we can really deal with it at that deeper level. And one of those causes we've already touched on briefly, which is a half century of belief that girls and women were powerless and that boys and men had the power, that boys and men were part of a patriarchy which made rules to benefit men at the expense of women, that masculinity was basically toxic, that males already had male privilege, that males already have male power. And so if we don't understand the paradox of male power, the coexistence of power in the way we define it as being at the top of a ladder and powerlessness inside of oneself, that all makes sense. But what also makes sense is something much deeper that's been happening in the last 50 years. And that is when somebody says that boys and men are having problems, the assumption is twofold. One is, well, they're having problems now, but eventually boys become men and they don't seem to have problems then. They have all the power, the privilege, and the inheritance of male patriarchy. So why pay attention to them? And if you are persisting on paying attention to them, Maybe it's because you don't understand all the problems of being oppressed that females have, and therefore maybe you're misogynist, so better shut your mouth. And if you try to explain, you're mansplaining. And so a toxic atmosphere has been happening that's preventing people from even speaking up about what might be a problem in the back of your mind. And you saw the problems that I had when I began to articulate boys and men's issues when I was speaking around the world as a feminist. It was, the loss of somewhere between $10 and $22 million worth of income over my lifetime. So it's a choice, and most people are having to support children. They're in a community that if they already think that boys and men are the problem and girls and women are the result of that problem, they feel hesitant about speaking up, because it doesn't just mean them not having the courage to speak up. It means the potential loss of job. It means the potential loss of respect from spouse. It means the potential loss of income from children. And we're all attracted to the dopamine that gets stimulated in our brain when we get approval from others. So it's very challenging for us to have a social group that we get a lot of approval from, love from, promotions from, respect from, and then to begin to challenge the underlying ideology, whether you're on the political left or political right, or no matter what you believe. It's very challenging to go against that. And that's, if we are really going to solve the problems of the future, we all have to listen to each other a lot better than we've been doing now, which is why I've been spending the last 30 years of my life doing a lot of couples communication courses, because I see that as the beginning of the way to teach people who differ to hear each other, to be able to be detectives who see a piece of the other person's puzzle, and then ask, instead of arguing about that piece, say, tell me more about another piece in the puzzle, another piece in the puzzle, another piece in the puzzle, until we see their entire picture. We can still disagree with the way their picture looks to us, and we need to have our chance to talk, but we need to not be stymied by our belief that if we hear them, that means we agree with them, and therefore we're evil like they are. So I'm going to deal with 5 underlying causes of the boy crisis. One is dad-deprived boys. The second is the one that I've just been referring to, this half-century of belief that girls and women are powerless, and males have male toxicity, male privilege, male power, and we're the oppressors that are born out of the patriarchy that made rules to benefit men at the expense of women. Third is the purpose void. Fourth is the fear of psychological attachment to someone that we may lose. And fifth is our repulsion for males who complain. How deeply that's built into all of our psyches. So I'll start out first with dad-deprived boys. When I submitted my proposal to my publisher for the Boy Crisis book, I identified about a dozen potential causes of the boy crisis, and I proposed that I would study each of them about equally. But the more I studied them, the more I saw that, well, for example, lack of male teachers, that was a problem. But it was mostly a problem only when a boy came from a female-only home and then went to a school with female-only teachers and had no male role model either at home or at school to be a constructive male role model. So everybody wants to belong, and boys like that, they often felt that they became attracted to a gang that said, be part of us. We'll give you reputation. We'll give you family. Or that they were so unmotivated, they produced very little in terms of income. They weren't able to buy the car. They weren't able to do things to attract girls. And so they ended up being attracted by dealing drugs, by which they could make about 10 times what they made flipping hamburgers. That, for an unmotivated boy, seemed really tempting. Plus, dealing drugs, you're part of that drug dealing community. And so you feel like you have family. And so when boys who grew up with fathers and involved and loving fathers didn't make much difference statistically whether they had many male teachers or not, or even any male teachers, because they had the involvement of their dad at home, and all the things that we'll be talking about in a little while that dads do. It was nice for them to have male teachers, but it wasn't crucial for them to have male teachers. So we'll be looking at that issue. So if I were to summarize what I discovered as the single most important of many of causes of the boy crisis, I would say that the boy crisis, more than anything else, the boy crisis resides where dads do not reside. And so what's to me is fascinating about this is why. Why has this happened? Do you remember when I mentioned in the last section about evidence? I talked about the UN's finding that boys have fallen behind girls in every one of the 70 largest developed nations. You probably hung on the word 70. Now I'd like you to switch your psyche to the word developed. In developed nations, something happens. There's enough people in the citizenry who have survival mastered that the government no longer has to prohibit divorces. And there doesn't need to be social pressure on women to be married before they have children. There's less shaming of single moms, and there's less shaming of people for getting divorces. The challenge here is this. The divorces often lead to fights between moms and dads who disappears. Most frequently, the dad disappears. Not always, but when he does, not because the dad disappears necessarily. Many, many men fight to be more involved with their children. When, for whatever reason, without focus on blame, that the children do lose their dad, that tends to have a huge impact on the benefits or the lack of benefits among the children. The boys tend to get depressed and tend to move into many problems that we'll explore in a few minutes. The second thing is single moms. Notice here the last two columns. In 1960, the percentage of single moms was 5%. Most recent data, 41% in the United States. You can see that most dramatically by looking at the right two columns. I want to be clear before I move on that from my perspective, I was married for a number of years, and then I met the woman who became my wife about 30 years ago. And between those marriages, I started dating women, but I found that the women who were women as opposed to girls were women who had children. And so I started dating women who had children. And almost every single mother that I dated used one word as much as the word love, which is the word overwhelmed. She often felt also guilty that she was not doing as well as she could at work compared to what she knew was inside of her capability-wise, and simultaneously was not doing the best she could for her children because she felt a constant pressure juggling act and being, as I said, overwhelmed. So I want to really acknowledge that. And I also want to say that the majority of boys, and this is very important, the majority of boys raised by single moms do well. So when you're looking at the boy crisis, you're not looking at what automatically happens when boys don't have fathers. The majority of boys raised by single moms do well psychologically, financially, and in terms of education. Two examples of that, whether you agree with the policies or not, two examples of that particular issues are Presidents Clinton and Obama. They both were dad-deprived boys. Obama had a very involved grandfather, but nevertheless, his biological dad was pretty absent. He wrote a book on that, and he describes to this day the hole in his heart that he still feels from the lack of dad involvement. But what must be said about both Obama and Clinton is that they were both motivated, and they both get higher speaking fees than I get. So, among those boys caught in the boy crisis, I want to read a letter to you that is the most tragic letter that Jordan Peterson and I have talked about quite a bit. And I've tried to help this boy who wrote this letter to me. I'll share a little bit about our efforts. but this is a tragic letter, the most tragic letter I've ever received. But it tells so much in a short period that I want to share this with you. Dr. Farrell, my mother was a feminist when she was young and chose to be a single mother voluntarily. Not having a father left a void in my life and a hole in my heart. The boy crisis described my life so accurately that if I didn't know better, I'd have thought you were spying on me. Growing up, I was not motivated to be involved with my peers, and my mother never pushed me to excel in academics. I developed an addiction to video games, which facilitated a life of increasing dysfunction and isolation that ended up with me being a recluse. I also developed a porn addiction due to not having a traditional outlet to release my sexual tension as a teenager. All of this was exacerbated by being socially ostracized and having frequent, intense, and vicious arguments with my mother. I was still living in my mother's basement and got heavily involved with 4chan and 8chan. I became involved, that is, with neo-fascist ideologies. And I was active within the incel community as well. I actually interacted briefly with the Aztec High School shooter through my contacts in the neo-fascist community, and I myself had written a 52-page manifesto outlining my plans to do a mass shooting. I slowly began to realize something was seriously wrong and my mental health had deteriorated dramatically as well. The boy crisis helped make sense of why I became who I was, and it was like waking up from a coma. I decided to go get help, and have recently been diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder. I've slowly been making progress at getting my life together. If it was not for you, sir, I think I would have eventually acted out on the beliefs expressed in my manifesto, as others that I worked with did in 8chan, such as the El Paso shooter Patrick Cruzius, or the Christchurch, New Zealand shooter Brenton Tarrant had. So I want to personally thank you, because I feel like you have saved not only my life, but potentially the lives of other innocent people. Sincerely, Carlos. So I decided that I had a responsibility to work with him a bit. And so I called up the president-elect at the time of Division 51 of the American Psychological Association, who was Daniel Ellenberg, and he and I worked together and sent the letter off to Jordan Peterson, and Jordan had a lot of very helpful comments. And among the three of us, we tried to do something to work with this boy. I'd like to say that we created miracles. We did not. We made progress. Yes, I think we did. But he's not out of the hole yet. I think he has promised me over and over again that he would never act on the mass shooting, but he still has enormous psychological problems that he's dealing with to this day. But it's such a sad and tragic summary of so much of what happens in exaggerated form. Fortunately for most boys that are dad deprived, it does not get taken this far. That's one example of the impact of lack of dad involvement. But then looking at some of the reasons for it, let's look at some of the discrimination that dads experience. So when dads do want to be involved with children, what is the psychological atmosphere that exists that allows something like this to happen? This is a boy, obviously. When I grow up, I will beat my wife. It's really hard to believe. I'm going to read you the subscript first because it's a little hard to read. The subscript says, girls who grew up in households with domestic violence are more likely to end up with abusive partners, break the cycle of domestic violence. Now, here's the fascinating thing about this picture. This is on the Dallas area transit. And in order to get something up on the Dallas area rapid transit, It would have to go through about a dozen layers of bureaucracy before it gets up there like this, that anyone who's worked with the government knows. And so it means that at every level of bureaucracy, there was approval for this ad going up saying, when I grow up, I will beat my wife. Can you imagine a boy looking at this? Or could you imagine the ad being reversed? Any of you who have read any of the work that I've done on domestic violence know that that domestic violence is unfortunately an equal opportunity offender. Both girls and boys hit each other about equally at every level of violence, including the killing level, but that's a more complex one to explain. So I'm not going to get into the data on that now, but we could imagine a girl saying, when I grow up, I will beat my husband, being featured on this. And imagine somebody suggesting this as the advertisement for the Dallas area rapid transit, and how fast that person would be seen as a misogynist. And therefore it wouldn't get anywhere. It's not the existence of this ad that is as important as the multiple levels of bureaucracy that reflect the attitude and the culture that would allow this ad to go through all of those unchecked and then have that appear as a government-sponsored phenomenon. Another example, the same group. One day my husband will kill me. Now, with domestic violence being about equal and men and women killing each other differently, that leads to the overt statistics saying more men kill women than women kill men. But the difference in the way men and women kill leads to data that shows that men and women kill each other about equally as well. And so, without getting into the complexity of that data, can you imagine there being a boy here saying, one day my wife will kill me? So this is part of the atmosphere that has led to discrimination against dads, that has led to the boy crisis. Let's look at something even more amazing, which is the Moynihan Report. In 1965, raise your hand if you've heard of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Senator. Okay, there was a fellow named Daniel Patrick Moynihan who was both a U.S. Senator. He had a PhD in sociology. He worked as Secretary of Labor under both Presidents Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. Because he was so respected at both sides of the aisle, he was asked to do something that just in popular culture became called the Moynihan Report. That came out in 1965. He was asked to study inner city violence and the causes of inner city violence. And there was, if it wasn't somebody who was so respected, people were going, wait a minute, we know that inner city violence is often caused by Black people. Is this going to be really racist? And is this really going to be, anti-Black and so on? And he got the freedom, though, to just study it. What he discovered was something very different than racism. He discovered that there was more violence inner city-wise caused by those 25% of males who were Black who were dad deprived, not the other 75% who were not dad deprived. At that point in time, 1965, only 3.2% of Caucasian males were dad deprived. That's 1965. Today, among Caucasian males, the percentage of dad deprived is 36%. That is about 40% higher than the statistic for Black males being dad deprived in 1965. So Caucasians have already exceeded the figure that led Moynihan to see this is the problem that causes inner city violence more than any other. And obviously, when you're studying percentages, because the percentages in a certain direction doesn't mean it applies in every case. Second, among Black males today, the figure is no longer 25% of Black males dad deprived, but 72%. So you can get a sense of, we've often been focusing on, in the back of our minds, maybe a racist idea, or we've been focusing on other solutions. We need to give more welfare money. We need to give more better schooling, better education. But almost all over when you see the data, including some new books that have come out on boys' issues, they keep saying, we don't know the reason for this. And yet the reason for this has been apparent to us since 1965. We're just unwilling to hear the reason for this. And I'll get to why we're unwilling to hear the reason for this in a little while as well. What happens when males are dad deprived is that there's a loss oftentimes among boys, but also among girls. Everything that happens to boys, with a couple of exceptions, also happens to girls who are dad deprived. The difference is they happen to boys more frequently and more intensely. More than 50 different metrics that lead to a parent's nightmare about what a child is going through are true for both girls and for boys. It's just more intensely and more frequently the case with boys. I mentioned before postponed gratification. Boys who are dad deprived, as a rule, are much more likely to not have postponed gratification. They're much less likely to be empathetic. They're much less likely to have social skills. They're much less likely to be motivated. They're more likely to be depressed, commit suicide, and have problems with their identity. This is just a few of the 50 ways. They're more likely to have ADHD, more likely to be obese, and many, many other of those ways. They're also much more likely to be addicted to alcohol, to drugs, to video games, and to porn. Since 1960, they're also far more likely to be imprisoned. And since 1980, California has built 23 prisons and 4 universities. Women have women's centers, and men also have men's centers. They're called prisons. Prisons are basically centers for dad-deprived boys. Some years ago, against Schwarzenegger, I ran for governor of California. And when I did, I spoke at a number of different prison populations. Fortunately, I asked this at the first prison I spoke with. I said, how many of you are dad deprived? I explained what dad deprived meant. And they about 85 to 95% were the averages in the prisons. And the prison guards never asked that question before. The people in the prison, the administrative staff, the grant fundraisers and so on, had never even noticed that. And so I began to talk about what dads contribute to children doing better in life. I had lineups of prisoners after my presentation waiting to speak to me. I remember one guy who was just a perfect example. He was, he had muscles like I'll never have, and tattoos, and he was really trying to repress his tears. And finally, he asked me if I would have the other men step back so they wouldn't see him talk to me. And he said, Dr. Farrell, I always thought I was a loser, that I was here because I deserved being here. I never realized how much I could contribute to my children not making the mistakes that I made being here. I am so motivated now to shorten my term in prison, to get out and help my children before they lose the ability to ever be helped by me. That was the story I heard again and again from people who self-described themselves as losers, who thought they were worthless, they were without purpose, they weren't needed, they were just a bother to people. When they saw that they could contribute something, that they could be needed, that they had something unique to contribute that I'll talk about soon, that's when they sort of turned around psychologically. Made a huge impact on me. In prison, a lot of ugly things happen. We all know about male rapes in prison that actually totally exceed male heterosexual rapes outside of prison. And just the humiliations that are often seen as very appropriate for prisoners to go through. There is a 700% increase in the prison population since 1972 up until 2013, and it's leveled off, fortunately, since 2013. What dad-deprived boys miss is a lot of things. I'll be sharing a few of those things here. One of the differences between dad style parenting and mom style parenting is roughhousing. And so let's say the dad has 3 children, and 2 of them are boys and 1 is a girl, let's say. A dad will typically do something like, okay, kids, let's do some roughhousing. The kids will go, all right. And so I'll take the 3 of you and put the 3 of you on the couch, and here's the game. The 3 of you jump off the couch, get onto my back, and the game is you see who can pin me down faster than I can pin all 3 of you down. I have to pin all 3 of you down. It's kind of unfair, but you see if you can pin me down first. All right, Dad. All right, Dad. Meantime, Mom's looking on and going, oh my God, I feel like I have just one more child to monitor. On the other hand, the mom doesn't want to interfere. She doesn't want to be controlling. She sees the kids are having fun, but there's a part of her that feels like, I just feel like, intuitively, I feel like sooner or later somebody's going to get hurt. Well, the mom is only about 99% likely to be right. Sooner or later, somebody gets hurt. And so when that happens, then mom starts feeling guilty. Like, I knew this intuitively. Why didn't I pay attention to my intuition and stop this before one of the kids got hurt? That's not right. Dads are so, my husband is so dense, but all right. At least I wasn't controlling. And now at least he'll see from real life experience that somebody got hurt. So he won't do this anymore. Not. Dad instead goes ahead and says, okay, Jimmy, you took your elbow and you put your elbow in your sister's face. You cannot do that as a way of winning at roughhousing. Okay, Dad, I got it. Mom's going, no. You're not going to let them go back to the roughhousing that you just learned led to one of the children being hurt. And sure enough, Dad goes back to the roughhousing, and the children, rather than pay attention to Dad, they get caught up in all the emotional excitement of winning again, forget completely what Dad said, and go ahead and doesn't actually stick the elbow in his sister's eye, but this time does something else that's too aggressive and not assertive. And Dad stops the roughhousing and says, what you did was not putting your elbow in your sister's eye, but what you did was aggressive. That's different than being assertive. What do you mean aggressive versus assertive? I think you exactly experienced what aggressive was. And you know what assertive is. Not so strong like that. Oh, okay, Dad. So now, because I warned you and you didn't do it this time, there's no more roughhousing tonight. Oh, Dad, now we understand. Now we'll do it. Nope, that's the end. No roughhousing tonight. What we'll have is in a few days, when you do things like your homework and things like that, get everything together. If you're on track, all 3 of you, not any one of you off track, we'll maybe have the roughhousing on Wednesday night rather than tonight, Sunday. Okay, Dad. Oh, and they really look forward to it between then and Wednesday, and they start really paying much more careful attention to doing what they have to do in order not to lose the privilege, because Dad will be more likely to say something like, if any one of you doesn't do this, all 3 of you are punished by not having the roughhousing. And so and Mom, in the meantime, was looking on, wait a minute, twice you've seen that somebody got hurt and you still are not paying attention to the signals? What do I have to do to help you realize that when you do the roughhousing like that, somebody's going to get hurt? Well, the next time, maybe the Wednesday comes and they continue the roughhousing. And this time, Dad says, you know the rules. Okay, Dad, we got it. But this time, as they're tempted to push the other one aside, be aggressive rather than assertive, stick their elbow in somebody's eye, they realize that if they do that, they are going to lose the roughhousing. And so they're now beginning to learn postponed gratification and empathy. Okay, let's take empathy first. They're now learning that their sisters and brothers have needs and that they are required to pay attention to those needs if they are going to get what they want, the roughhousing. And so the beginning of empathy develops, and studies show that dads that roughhouse, and mostly this way, not all dads do it as well, but the dads who roughhouse, their children are more likely to be empathetic. Again, not because Dad is saying be empathetic, but because the children are losing what they want if they don't think of somebody else's needs besides theirs. The children are also learning that I really do want, if you and I are brothers, I really do want to push you out of the way to win, but I have to learn postponed gratification. Not because dad teaches me postponed gratification and says I have to learn it. Those words are too big to learn anyway. But because I don't get what I want, roughhousing, unless I think of something other than what I want immediately. I want to get what I want in the long run. The roughhousing is more important than just pushing my brother and sister aside and then losing the roughhousing. And how do I know I'm going to lose the roughhousing? Because the last time I didn't do this, I lost the roughhousing. Moms are very likely to also say the same types of rules, but when the children break the rules, the moms are more likely to repeat the rules. That's boundary setting. Dads are more likely to be what some people consider cruel, and that is to enforce the boundaries after they've warned the child once or at the most twice. And the parents, obviously any mom can do the same thing, do boundary enforcement. The parents who do boundary enforcement are far more likely to have children that cry at first, but then learn that they don't get what they really want unless they do what is required of them. And they start doing what is required of them. So the dynamics lead to an increase in empathy, and it also leads to an increase in the father-children bond. From the bond of dad's a lot of fun, we can have a lot of fun with him. I want to do this again. I want to have more fun with him. Dads can then take that bond and begin to extract things that they want from the children that lead to the children being better children that otherwise would be seen as criticism as opposed to dad helping us become a winner. And so when I used to be raising children oftentimes, and also when I was a camp counselor, if I would kick a goal through to a boy, and I would win in playing soccer when he didn't work hard enough, and I wanted to teach him a lesson by winning, which I would restrain myself from doing when he was working hard, the boy would see me as training him to become a winner. But when I was raising daughters, the daughters needed to learn that that was helping them become a winner because they didn't naturally see that I was helping them become a winner. They thought that I was defeating them and that they felt defeated. And so they had to redo their psychology around what the bond could lead to in terms of helping them win. So the bond, the postponed gratification, the empathy. Also notice I was saying before, the father was asking the child to distinguish between being assertive versus aggressive. Well, children who learn that distinction are much more likely to have friends in school. When children have friends in school, that increases their dopamine from their peers approving of them. So the friends in school motivates them to get approval from my group, who are now more likely to be groups of winners because who have also learned postponed gratification. So they move into more highly motivated friends who then motivate them to produce more because producing more is rewarded as opposed to put down and mocked. And so all of these things happen from the bond, the empathy, the postponed gratification, the understanding of the differences between being assertive versus aggressive. These are part of what is the bond that dads create. And the important thing about this is that no one is explaining this to anyone. And I do not blame moms for not understanding this because moms can't hear what dads don't say. I also don't blame dads for not saying this because one of the reasons I wrote about these distinctions in the Boy Crisis book was because I couldn't find them anywhere. I couldn't find them in magazines and books. And so I started seeing these distinctions. And when I shared them, that rang true for many parents. And so I started putting them in writing. And then that allowed parents to be able to say, oh, wait a minute. Dad is not just roughhousing in a sort of careless type of way that's going to lead to the children being hurt. This actually creates all these outcomes on average that are beneficial to the children. I don't blame dads for not explaining this to moms because dads had nowhere to read this either. And without any context of this, most dads don't say, I want to roughhouse with the kids so they'll develop greater empathy. Like what? what could be more counterintuitive than empathy developing from roughhousing? And so this, by not being part of the cultural awareness, is leading to so many children being hurt, not having this bond, not having the postponed gratification, not having this distinction between being assertive and aggressive. That has been hurting both children and also the potential for dad involvement, because when a dad goes to court to fight for the children, no judge understands this either. And so this is the price of this cultural absence of empathy and knowledge about the importance of dads. Thank you.